Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, July 25th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the generic congressional vote / the generic ballot, whatever you want to call it, for the 2022 midterms, and the lackluster results I have been seeing here for the GOP, and why this doesn't exactly point me in the direction that 2022 is going to be a quote-unquote red wave year. Now, I have been saying for quite some time that it is going to be a red wave year, and that's largely because I expect the Republican Party to expand where they are right now. Taking a look at the generic congressional vote from the 2020 presidential election, the Republican Party did much better than what the polls had actually predicted. But in 2018 and 2016, they were practically spot on. You take a look at some elections too, for instance, the 2010 midterm elections, where the Democratic Party lost 63 seats to the GOP. They won control of the House of Representatives, and yet the Democratic Party actually did better than the polls had predicted. So depending on the midterm election year, the polls aren't always going to be super accurate, and sometimes they are, or just whatever generic congressional vote you want to take a look at. But as of right now, the numbers that I am seeing don't tell me what I need to know in terms of what should be an expected red wave year. What I think will happen this November is that, at least for the sake of the GOP, their generic ballot numbers get better. Because believe it or not, this is not their best point during the 2022 elections. It should be November, but in reality, it actually is January of 2022. When you track the generic ballot over the past 6-7 months, one thing becomes very clear: that the polls really don't change far too often. Sometimes they narrow up. In recent times, we've seen the Democratic Party within 2 points of the GOP. On other extremes, they've been down 3 points against the Republicans. But for a pretty significant period of time, Republicans maintained a 3 to 4 point lead pretty consistently over the weeks in the early and late months of January and February of 2022. And what you found was that those leads were larger than what the Republican Party has today, despite Joe Biden's approval rating being considerably worse. I want you to track this with me and sort of understand why I'm a bit confused and a bit apprehensive as I continue declaring 22 a red wave. You know, I've been referring to this year as practically going to be a very easy year for the GOP to win many, many things. But I can't say that I'm getting more confident in that as the days progress. Joe Biden's approval rating might be getting worse, but the Republican Party's performance in key swing states and on the national level hasn't exactly gotten better. Don't get me wrong. I still expect the Republican Party to win control of the House, and the Senate is honestly a toss-up. The fact is, though, the fact that the Senate is a toss-up when all you need is one seat is an indicator that 2022 isn't going as well for the GOP as maybe a 2014 type of environment would have been, or even 2010. Looking at the Biden approval rating, I want to point out one major timestamp, and that is February and practically the end of January 2022, where Joe Biden's approval rating was hovering around negative 12.8% nationwide. Now, coinciding with him being down 12.8%, the Republican Party got their largest lead on the generic ballot to date, 4 points over the Democratic Party nationwide. Today, they stand 2.5% ahead of the Democrats, a 1.5% reduction. And in terms of the voters out there that were willing to vote for the respective parties, that also seemed to decrease. But the problem is that the approval rating for Biden didn't get better from where it was in February of 2022. In fact, it has gotten considerably worse. What was negative 13 has turned into negative 20, yet the generic ballot has moved in favor of the Democratic Party. It's so insane to wrap your head around that a president such as Biden can be down 20 points nationwide, and yet the Republicans can only find themselves up 2.5%. When we initially looked at this generic ballot, the general and standard rule of thumb was that the generic ballot was off by about 10 points from Biden's approval rating. We're getting to the point where it's off by nearly 20 points. That's why this gets difficult to start to predict a red wave year as the months and months go on, and the Republican Party doesn't do that much better, in fact, some cases worse than where they were 4 or 5 months ago, despite Biden having a considerably higher portion of the public against him than where he was prior to. You know, looking at where the GOP is today, I'm not exactly convinced that they are going to have a 2010 or 2014 year that they are certainly and desperately hoping for, considering that the Democratic Party is in the trifecta right now, meaning they control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. The House, I do still believe, and I will maintain this belief for as long as the midterms are going on, because that's just how it is based off of our previous map, that the House is a foregone conclusion. Republicans are going to win it easily. Right now, Republicans are just down 4 seats in the House of Representatives. They were down 5 following the 2020 elections. There was a special election in Texas's 34th congressional district. As a result, the Democrats lost that district. It was a pretty solid Biden district, and thus, now the Republicans have 1 more seat from where they had back in 2020, meaning that majority is just 4 seats for the Democratic Party. Practically anywhere you look, they will tell you it is a foregone conclusion. 75% chance for the GOP, according to the JHK forecast. You look at FiveThirtyEight, 85% chance. No matter where you're looking, the Republican Party is undoubtedly expected to win control of the House. But that didn't exactly come as something so easy as you might think. The fact is, the Democratic Party is just down 4 seats. To remind you of how far down they were, and the Republican Party was in 2010, they were down a considerable portion across the map. Look at the 2018 House map, for instance. Wrap your head around the fact that the GOP had nearly an equal chance at winning the House majority in 2010 as they did in 2022, or as they do now. They were going against a 257 to 178 majority, and they did it, props to them, but they had an equal chance to a House map that isn't nearly as blue. That is about 4 seats in the advantage compared to the Republican Party and the Democratic Party's deficit here in favor of the Democratic Party of about 79 seats. 79 seats versus 4, and you see a near equal chance. That's not to say that, that's something that we really need to talk about too much in depth about the chances back then, what people were expecting, but I will say that the Republican Party of 2010 took a map that was so insanely unfavorable towards them. And yes, a lot of it had to do with congressional redistricting and ensuring that they were going to win some districts, but it's a game that both parties played very well. And guess what? By the time we reached 2010, we weren't working with the new House districts, meaning that all the work that was done to flip the map from this being blue to red, just look at that. Look at that change in just 2 years. The entire nation going from blue to solid red. This happened because the GOP organized so effectively that they were able to turn some very, very negative aspects of the House maps, negative aspects of their House incumbents and races and things of that nature that resulted them to lose by such a dramatic amount in 2008 and turned it into a victory. The GOP is going to turn the 2020 House map into a victory. The question is by how much? But one thing is clear. They will not be picking up 63 seats. And the Democratic Party, quite frankly, doesn't have 63 seats to give them. But even based off of the forecasted majority for the GOP, we're not going to be seeing numbers that are similar to 2010, at least with a generic ballot that looks like this. Republicans need to replicate a number that looks like the one in 2010 if they want any chance at winning the way Republicans did back then. Republicans did the impossible, flipped a House that was the largest majority for the Democratic Party in decades. Looking at the 2010 generic congressional vote, the final numbers on Election Day, Republican plus 9.4%. Gallup had the GOP ahead by 15. CNN by 10. Fox News by 13. Rasmussen reports by 12. Those same pollsters today are telling us that maybe Rasmussen reports has the GOP ahead, but you look at Fox News, Republicans plus 3. You take a look at every other pollster here, some of them even have the Democratic Party ahead. This only happens because the GOP isn't able to win over voters the way they were in 2010 or 2014. The Republican Party's ability to win the House has been primarily reliant on them winning the popular vote when it comes down to the generic ballot. Because when Democrats won it in 2018, they won control of the House for the first time in 8 years. And it took them winning on the generic ballot by 7 points. Republicans won a very similar amount in the popular vote. Won a very similar amount in the House vote with a majority in the House, of course, retaining it from 2010. But the Democratic Party actually won the popular vote in this case. The Republican Party is going to do better than they did in 2020 because the generic ballot is a lot more on their side. Democrats won here by 3. Republicans are expected to win by 3. Realistically speaking, somewhere around 4. But this is not what we really should be expecting from a GOP that is taking advantage of a president that is so painfully down when it comes down to approval. Even looking back at past elections, for instance 2014 or 2010, the worst for Obama at this point was -11, -12. In 2010, when Republicans were up by 9, Obama was only down by 5. The GOP tapped into voters that approved of Obama that were still willing to elect Republicans. In 2014, there was some drop-off. There were voters out there that disapproved of Obama that still voted for the Democratic Party. But in the races that mattered, those 9 Senate races that the Democratic Party lost to the GOP, giving them control of the U.S. Senate until the Democrats won it back 6 years later, what had happened was that even if there was drop-off, you still saw the Republican Party win by 6. We don't know if we are going to be able to see that this time around, and the problem is that they have a such more simpler plan at winning the Senate majority, at winning the House majority. This is the easiest election for the GOP on record, and they are in a point where they might actually mess it up. The House is a foregone conclusion, but what about the Senate? It is crazy to me that the balance of power is hanging in by just a singular seat, and the GOP can't even ramp up their national numbers for a president that is the most disapproved of in a midterm election, even more so than Trump or Bush in their respective midterm elections for their first term or potentially only term, depending on who we're talking about here. And what you found, or even what you saw with Bush in some cases, depending on the poll in 2006, regardless, Biden is down more than Obama, Trump, Bush, even Clinton at different points. And that's why this is so crazy that the Democratic Party is so able to hold on, or maybe rather than the Democratic Party being so able to hold on, the Republican Party has an inability to win over voters. What was a 10-point deficit is now slowly turning into 20. We are quite literally 3 points off from this being a 20-point deficit between the Biden disapprove and the generic ballot. There's clearly something more at play here, and a lot of it has to do with the Republican Party's ineffectiveness and inability to win over voters when it should be so painfully easy. If I was a Republican operative at this point, I would really be upset because I know that these races were so winnable from the very beginning. And a lot of it has to do with who the GOP decided to nominate. The Republican Party has really brandished itself as a party of President Trump, the same person that was rejected in the 2020 presidential election. And it doesn't look like they are too willing to go ahead and reject Donald Trump again. It looks like many Republicans, in fact, want him to run again. That association with the GOP is likely what is dragging them down. What they didn't have in 2014 or 2010 was a sore loser John McCain or Mitt Romney, still on the campaign trail, still trying to vie for the presidency even though they were rejected by voters. I get it. President Trump won in 2016. But when you lose your re-election bid, it's not a sign that you should return, especially when you would never accept the results of the election in the first place. This idea that the election was stolen, the insurrection, and everything negative associated with President Trump is still associated with the GOP. I'm not going to say that President Trump is the only reason why they are down, but I do think that it plays a major part because this image of the Republican Party, one that voters really aren't able to shake, is what's likely going to maintain the Republican Party's narrow/slim lead going into the midterms. The Republicans will still be ahead and will still win control of a very, very important chamber and could still very well win control of another very important chamber. But it would have been so much easier in any other type of circumstance had Donald Trump removed himself from the entire environmental politics, on top of the environment of politics. On top of that, many other considerations here the GOP could have done, such as have better Senate candidates that could have turned around the trajectory of this race. They could have had Sean Parnell in the state of Pennsylvania. They could have had another Republican in Georgia, Doug Collins, for instance, or someone even better. In Arizona, they could have propped up Doug Ducey, who I think would have easily won. They could have convinced Chris Sununu to run for Senate in the state of New Hampshire. The point being that there were many missed opportunities for the GOP, and a lot of it has to do with their association and the way that voters perceive them across the country. This has been hindering the GOP, and despite Biden continuing to dip, the Democratic Party remains strong. They aren't ahead, and I'm not trying to build this idea that they are somehow leading the Republican Party or that they will win the popular vote. I don't believe either of those two cases, because quite frankly, they are losing to the GOP. But this should have been a question of how large this defeat for the Democratic Party is going to be, and not a question if the defeat will be large at all. The midterm environment is so painstakingly perfect for the Republican Party, and yet they decide for themselves that they are going to, at least in some races, screw it up. It could have been so much easier. I say this all the time. and the generic congressional vote being 2.5% in the lead for the GOP only confirms, after 7 months of a lead, narrower than where it was 6 months ago, tells me that my suspicions are correct, that the GOP is not exactly doing as well as we otherwise might think. If in a month and a half from now, 2 months from now, the GOP's lead on the generic ballot is similar to where it is right now, it becomes past a point of breaking away from the national numbers. It becomes past a point of changing tremendously in favor of the GOP. Elections have changed quickly overnight, but when it comes down to a question of generic ballot, rather than Trump or Clinton or Trump or Biden or candidate versus candidate, it becomes more difficult to sway the national numbers, and as a result, the GOP might be stuck with a 2.5% lead when they have other midterm elections where they are ahead by 6 points, sometimes even higher. It really just depends. 7 points in one election. Right now, they're only ahead by 2.5. We will see what happens this November. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 midterm election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today. Sorry, tomorrow.